We are going to look at Kingdom Protista. If you remember, there are 6 different kingdoms. There is Kingdom Archaebacteria, which is ancient bacteria. They're eukaryotes. They live in real extreme environments. Then there's Kingdom Eubacteria, which is the bacteria that you think of when you think of bacteria. Then there's Kingdom Protista, and Kingdom Protista is what's often called the junkyard kingdom, because these creatures are eukaryotes, so we can't call them bacteria, but they're not a fungus, they're not a plant, they're not an algae. For example, to be an animal, you have to be a heterotroph, which means you feed. You don't have a cell wall. You move at some point in time in your life. You're a eukaryote, and you're multicellular. Well, there's some creatures out there that fit all the definitions of being an animal, but they're not multicellular, for example. So we have to put them somewhere, so we just kind of throw them into this leftover kingdom. Algae will be in this kingdom. Algae are not plants. To be a plant, you have to have roots, stems, and leaves. And to be a root, you have to fit certain definitions. To be a stem, you have to fit certain definitions. So even though algae, which you think of as seaweed, looks like a plant, it can't be called a plant because it doesn't have certain parts. Well, it's not a bacteria, so we had to put it somewhere, so we put it in this kingdom. So Kingdom Protista is it's often called the junkyard kingdom, or it's kind of the leftover kingdom. If you don't fit anywhere else, we have to put you somewhere, and this is where we put you up. And right now there's 6 kingdoms: Kingdom Archaebacteria, Eubacteria, Protista, Fungi, Animalia, and Planta. But there's a lot of support into taking Kingdom Protista and dividing it up into 3 kingdoms. So in a few years from now, there might not even be a Kingdom Protista to talk about. So in the case of Protist, okay, what we're looking at here is a euglena. We got ourselves a paramecium. With Protists, like we mentioned, with cell types, they are eukaryotic. Okay? That means that they have a nucleus. Okay? They are mostly unicellular. The exception to the rule will be some of your algae, not all of your algae, but what you think of as seaweed is algae. And you'll see that seaweed is classified according to its color. And so there's like green algae, there's red algae, there's brown algae, but seaweed can't be called a plant. It doesn't fit the definitions that we've set for plants. So we had to put them somewhere, we put them here. And plants don't live in water. Well, seaweed and algae do. You say, well, some trees grow out of water. That's not the same, because if you'll notice, protists do live in aquatic environments. There is no protist with a unique characteristic all to itself, because everything in Kingdom Protista is like something else. So you'll see that we take Kingdom Protista and we divide them into just 3 generic groups. Like you're things that are animal-like, which means you're almost an animal according to definition, but I can't call you an animal, so I have to put you somewhere, I put you here. And you're going to see that that's a group called protozoans. Or you're almost a plant, but I can't call you a plant, so I have to put you here. And so you're algae. And then there's this group that's almost a fungus, but I can't call it a fungus, so I have to put it somewhere. So it's fungus-like. So right now, like I said, we have 6 kingdoms, but it's very, very, very possible in the near future we'll have 8 kingdoms. Kingdom Protista will not exist anymore. There will be what's called Kingdom Protozoa, Kingdom Algae, and then not really sure what the fungus-like kingdom, but we'll talk more about that here in a moment. Okay. But with protists, they are eukaryotic, which means they have a nucleus. They're unicellular, with the exception of your seaweed, and they live in aquatic environments. Okay. Now, as far as nutrition goes, protists are all over the board. Some of them are autotrophs, like algae. They can do photosynthesis, or they'll do something called chemiosynthesis. So if you make your own food, you are an autotroph. Remember, if you have to feed, you are a heterotroph. Well, there's 2 ways you can feed. Okay? You can be what's called an internal heterotroph, like you and me. We put food in our bodies, and we break down the food inside of us. And so that's like what a lot of the protozoans do. Or you can do it externally, which is what the fungus-like group does. This is how fungi feed. Fungi have these things that look like roots that they dig into whatever their food source is. And then they're called hyphae. And then these roots will secrete digestive enzymes. And those enzymes break down the food source outside of the fungus's body. And then the fungus will turn around and just slurp the nutrients up. Spiders do the same thing. So you're either an autotroph or a heterotroph. Autotrophs make their own food. Heterotrophs feed. But just depending on how you feed, protists can be divided up into different groups. Now, like I mentioned, there are 3 types of protists. There is this group that's animal-like. It doesn't have a cell wall. It has a nucleus. It moves. It's a heterotroph. It cannot be called an animal because it's not multicellular. All members in the group, animal-like, which we call protozoa, are unicellular. Proto means first, zoa means animals. So this is the first group of animal-like creatures on Earth. And in all honesty, this will probably become a kingdom by itself, and it will be called Kingdom Protozoa. We have the plant-like, which are your algae. They can't be called plants because they don't have, by definition, roots, stems, or leaves. And some algae are unicellular. And so this will probably be a group by itself in the future. It will have kingdom algae. And then there's a group that's fungus-like. These guys have a cell wall like a fungus. They are external heterotrophs like a fungus. They're decomposers like a fungus. But fungi are multicellular. These guys are unicellular, but they'll come together like a crowd and all work together. But because they are not multicellular, we can't call them fungi. And this will probably become a group by itself as well. These are slime molds, molds and mildews, like in your shower. If you've ever picked up like your shampoo bottle and there's like this pink kind of slime on the bottom of it, that's slime mold. That's this group here. It's not going to hurt you. It's actually feeding off of your dead skin that's collected in the shower. But this group is probably going to be divided further. So we're probably going to take this group and divide it into 3 kingdoms by itself. And Kingdom Protista will no longer exist because we do have biochemical evidence now. We can look at the DNA and figure out how these things are related to animals, how they're related to fungi, how they're related to plants. But right now we just have 6 kingdoms because we have Kingdom Protista. But by the time your kids take biology, we're probably going to have 8 kingdoms. Kingdom Protista will not be one of them anymore because we're going to take Kingdom Protista and divide them up into these 3 groups. So let's look at different types of protist. Okay. The first group we're going to look at here are your protozoans. You guys know that zo or zoo means animal. Proto means first. So we believe that over many years, these guys eventually became the animals we know today. Like animals, they're heterotrophs. Like animals, they don't have a cell wall. Like animals, they move at some point in time in their life. And like animals, I think I said they don't have a cell wall. They move, they're heterotrophs, and they're eukaryotes. They have a nucleus. These guys cannot be called animals because they're unicellular. To be an animal, you have to be multicellular. But they have all the other characteristics of being an animal. We have to put them somewhere, so we put them in this group. And so scientists try to name creatures so that when you see their scientific names, it gives you a clue about these creatures. Well, these creatures are all going to be based on how they move, their locomotion. So, for example, this little guy here looks like a fuzzy slipper. This is called a paramecium, and this is an actual picture of a paramecium here. It moves with these little hairs called cilia. This is called a stentor. It moves like a worm. But these guys are all going to be divided up into groups. Sorry, it's moving. They're all going to be divided into groups based on how they move. So we're in Kingdom Protista. You're going to see these guys are in phylums. Okay, again, scientists try to give you clues. Anytime you see phylum, it means it does not have a cell wall. So it's going to be an animal or a member of this group. Anytime you see division, it means it does have a cell wall. So something like a fungus, an algae, a plant. So if you're taking a test and the question is talking about a plant and there's phylum, you might not know what phylum Arthropoda is, but you know the question is talking about a plant and a phylum is something with no cell wall, so that can't be the answer. So when you look at the names of these creatures, and you'll need to jot the names down somewhere on your page, the names give you a clue as to how they move. So the first group here move using cilia. So somewhere on your paper, please write phylum Ciliophora. Okay. Again, obviously, when they name these creatures, they try to give you some clue about them. Phylum lets you know that there's no cell wall. Okay. This is a paramecium. Okay. You can see all the cilia coming off of it. So you can see that cilia is in its name. For means to have. So this is a creature that has cilia. So this creature moves with these cilia, and these cilia act like oars, like they'll row like a boat. And this guy right here is our friend the paramecium. And you're like, okay, why do I need to know what a paramecium is? Well, there are lots of protozoans out there in the world. If you go swimming in the ocean, if you go swimming in a lake, if you go swimming in a stream, these little guys are swimming all around you. But this guy is actually really important as far as evolution is concerned. It is only one cell. It moves with cilia. Cilia, these little oars that it rows with. But if you'll notice, it looks like a fuzzy slipper turned upside down in this picture. This is the toe. This is where you would put your foot, and then that would be your heel. Well, in the case of paramecium are some of the first creatures in nature to show what will become a digestive system. Okay. When you eat, you put food into your mouth. And then it goes down your throat into your stomach. Well, these guys don't have mouths, but they do have an opening called the gullet. Okay. We don't have gullets, but other animals have gullets. Right. The gullet would be like their mouth. You have a food tube called the esophagus. Okay. Well, if you'll notice, they have what looks like a little tube right there. Okay. This little opening. Okay. So that would be like their throat. And from your esophagus, your food tube, food goes into your stomach. Well, they don't have a stomach. They're just one cell. But they do make this little thing called a food vacuole. So as far as evolution is concerned, this is one of the first creatures to have a digestive system. Okay. They have a mouth. They have a throat, and they have something very similar to your stomach. Now, I say very similar. You guys understand what I'm talking about. Okay. But what's also cool about these guys is they have what's called a contractile vacuole. They live in water, and they have to worry about swelling up. Just remember osmosis and diffusion. So water constantly goes into their body. Well, they have to get rid of that water or they'll explode. So they have this thing called a contractile vacuole. It will fill up with water, and when it gets full, it contracts, which means it squeezes, and it shoots that extra water out of the paramecium. So if you think about it, it's getting rid of extra water. So the contractile vacuole, many years later, might be where our kidneys or our bladder came from. But somewhere on your page, make sure you write that Ciliophora, and make sure you note that the example is this thing called a paramecium. The next group move using flagella. Right? And flagella act like whips, or they act like boat propellers or airplane propellers. They'll spin, and that's what pushes this little creature through. Now, somewhere on your page, write that they are in phylum Zomastogena. You'll hear me calling it Zomastigophora, same thing. Zo lets you know it's an animal-like creature. Mast means whip. So this is an animal-like creature that moves with a whip, and the whips are flagella. Okay. Most creatures will have 1, 2, 3 flagella, as you can see, and hopefully they're all on the same end, because you'd hate to have a flagella over here too, because bless its heart, it would just spin and spin and spin. Okay. But these guys move with flagella, and so please note that this will be a group called Zomastogena, or Zomastigophora. You also have this group called amoebas. Amoebas belong in what's called phylum Rhizopoda. Now, anytime you see rise always means root. Anytime you see pod means foot. So this basically means it has a root foot. So notice over here, it kind of looks like a root. So when scientists name these creatures, they try to tell you something about them. Okay? Well, amoebas move using these things called pseudopods. Okay? They basically look like pieces of snot crawling across the table. Okay? They're clear, they're see-through, but they crawl. And they crawl by making these little things called pseudopods. And they kind of grow out of their body just like a root grows out of a plant. And then they'll latch on, and then it crawls. Then they'll stretch these things out again. Then the rest of the body crawls to catch up with it. This is also how they'll catch food. So if a little bacteria comes and lands right here, it'll take their pseudopods and wrap it around their food source and secrete digestive enzymes, and that's how they feed. But these guys get their names because they have root-like feet, which basically means that they're, just like you walk, you stretch your feet out, and the rest of your body comes with it. Their feet look like roots, and the rest of the body just crawls along behind it. So ciliophoras move with cilia. The cilia act like oars, so they kind of row. So that's going to help push the creature through the water. In the case of Zomastogena, they have flagella that act like boat propellers to help push the creatures through the water. And amoeba kind of swim or crawl using these. The last group is unique because all these guys have moved in some way, shape, or form. But the last group are called your sporozoa. They don't move. They have to be picked up and carried. So they could be carried by wind. Most of the time, they can be carried by an animal, or they're carried by food or water. But most of these guys are parasitic. So they will get into a host and let the host carry them around. So all of these protozoans, these animal-like creatures, are classified based on how they move. Make sure you have ciliophora written down. They move using cilia. Make sure you have Zomastogena written down. They move using flagella. You have Rhizopoda written down. They move using those pseudopods. And then you have Sporozoa written down. Sporozoans do not move by themselves. They're parasites. They're going to be carried from place to place. So just these examples that we talked about. Okay. The amoeba here was an example of the phylum Rhizopoda. And then we have the paramecium here, which was the member of the group Ciliophora. Okay. But these creatures are all animal-like. Okay. They're heterotrophs. They are eukaryotes. They move at some point in time in their lives. They don't have a cell wall, but we cannot call them animals because they're unicellular. We talked about how sporozoans, a lot of sporozoans were parasites. Well, an example of one is this guy called Plasmodium. Plasmodium causes the disease malaria. Well, this little creature lives in the saliva of a mosquito. And you know how small mosquitoes are, so imagine how small this creature is. Well, when a mosquito bites you, and it tends to be the female, she puts some of her saliva into you first, because her saliva has a blood thinner in it. So when she bites you, just like if you were to bite somebody, some of your spit would get on the person's arm. When the mosquito bites you, some of her spit goes into your skin. And then she'll turn around and suck up the blood. Well, a lot of us are allergic to the chemicals in her spit. So that's why we itch and it swells. Well, if the mosquito is infected with this little creature, when she injects you with her spit, this little creature can get inside of you. And it looks very much like a worm. What you're seeing here are red blood cells. Okay, this is what red blood cells should look like. Well, these red blood cells have been infected by the Plasmodium. So this is a blood disease, and so it causes your red blood cells to shrivel up and die. Well, without your red blood cells, you don't get the nutrients you need to your body. So you can see why malaria is not a good thing. Some are mutualist. If you have a mutualistic relationship, that means you help each other out. And so some of these guys, for example, you guys know termites eat wood. Well, termites can't use the wood. Okay. Termites eat the wood, but they can't break it down. They have these little creatures, these little trypanosoma, or these little Zomastogena that live in their bellies. And so when the termites eat the wood, they're actually feeding these little itsy-bitsy protists. and the protists break the wood down. And, the termites eat more wood than the protists need the sugar for. So any sugar that's left over, the termites get. But the termites are actually eating the wood to feed this little creature that's in its belly. And then that little creature breaks down the wood and feeds the termite sugar. So that's what it means to be a mutualist. They're both helping each other. Which leads us now to our algae group. Okay. Algae is the plant-like group. Like plants, they are autotrophs. Like plants, they are eukaryotes. Like plants, they have a cell wall. But for the most part, some of these creatures are unicellular, and some of these creatures are multicellular. So the unicellular creatures can't be called plants. But the multicellular creatures can't be called plants either because they don't have plant parts, which we'll talk about. But in the case of algae are classified based on their color. So what kind of pigment they have. And so notice here, these guys all have division. Before we talked about phylum Rhizopoda, phylum Zomastogena. These have divisions. So if you see division in front of a name, that lets you know it has a cell wall. So it's a plant, an algae, or a fungus. Anytime you see phyta, that's a clue that it's a plant or an algae. Anthophyta are plants with flowers. Bryophyta are mosses. Chlorophyta is green algae. So scientists are trying to give you clues when you see these really funky names to figure out what it is that you're looking at. So you guys know chlorophyll is green. So chlorophyta is green algae. And this is where plants probably came from. And again, algae can be unicellular or multicellular. Unicellular algae are where we get most of the oxygen on Earth from. Okay. And there's so much unicellular algae that it looks like pond scum. But when we talk about what's called phytoplankton, phyto means plant or algae. Phytoplankton is the base of many of your food chains. But again, we can't consider them plants because some of them are unicellular, but they don't have real roots, stems, or leaves. Now, algae, seaweed, would be your multicellular algae. That's the stuff that you can see. So, for example, red algae. Red algae grows on the bottom of the ocean floor, so it's got these things that look like roots. But a definition of roots is it absorbs water. Well, these little things don't absorb water. They don't have to. The algae lives in water. Well, red algae, for example's name is rhodophyta. Brown algae, it's commonly called kelp. It's phaeophyta. Green algae, as you know, is chlorophyta. Well, they obviously are going to do photosynthesis a little bit different. Green algae has chloroplast. Obviously, red algae and brown algae don't. And red algae and brown algae actually are used a lot in frozen foods because they create a chemical that holds temperature really well. If you've ever made homemade ice cream melts really fast. But the ice cream you buy at the store doesn't melt as fast. That's because it actually has algae byproducts in it. And it helps hold those temperatures in. But there's pyrophyta. Pyro being orange algae. There's chrysophyta. Chryso meaning golden algae. So algae are going to be named according to the color that they are. And just some famous examples of algae. This guy here is called Spirogyra. It's multicellular. And it gets its name because its chloroplasts actually form a spiral through the cells. This creature here is called a volvix. And volvix is one of the stars of the algae world. This is not one cell. Each of these is one cell. Volvix is what's called a columnar or a columnar algae. It forms colonies. So what these cells do is they get together and they secrete a mucus layer. And all those little dots there are chloroplast. So not only do they have chloroplast in them, they have chloroplast around them. It's like having all these solar panels that can collect even more sunlight for you so you can make even more sugar. And then there's this guy down here called the euglena. The euglena is kind of a mystery because it's green. It does photosynthesis, so it's an algae, but it doesn't have a cell wall. So it's an animal-like question mark? Well, we call euglena algae because it is green and it does do photosynthesis. It's not a plant, no roots, stems, or leaves. It's not multicellular, but we put euglena in a group of green algae. It's actually a group all by itself. It's called Division Euglenophyta because it's cool. Unlike the other algae, it doesn't have a cell wall. And unlike the other green algae, if you take green algae and put it in the dark, it's going to die. What's cool about the euglena is if the euglena gets in areas that are dark, it will start to eat. So euglena spend most of their time being autotrophs, but if times are bad, they can become heterotrophs and feed off of other things. It is believed that green plants evolved from algae because they do have the same type of pigment. They have chlorophyll in them. Red algae does not have chlorophyll. Brown algae does not have chlorophyll. Fire algae has carotene, like carrots. It doesn't have chlorophyll. And they have the same cell wall composition, which is cellulose. Brown algae does not have cellulose in its cell walls. Red algae does not have cellulose in its cell walls. So, if it looks like a rabbit, feels like a rabbit, it's probably a rabbit. These things look alike. They have a lot of the same parts. So at some point in time, this little seaweed was born with these mutations that made it become plants years on down the line. They also have the same life cycle called alternation of generations. And this is a pretty complicated life cycle, and we tend to talk about it when we do plants. But basically when you alternate, you go back, forth, back, forth, back, and forth. And remember, generations would be like grandparent, parent, kid. Well, we talked about diploid. Remember, diploid means it has both sets of DNA. Haploid means it has half the set of DNA. Well, in alternation of generations, one parent would be diploid. So let's say it has 46 chromosomes. Then its kid would be haploid. It only had 23 chromosomes. But then its kid would go back to being diploid again with 46 chromosomes. But we'll talk more about that when we do plants. Which then leads us to the fungus-like group, which I know is not on your sheet. But this is the group that, once we figure out how we're going to define this group, we're going to take Kingdom Protista and divide it up. To be a fungus, you have to have a cell wall. And to be a fungus, you have to be a heterotroph. Most of them are decomposers or parasites. To be a fungus, you have to be a eukaryote. And to be a fungus, you have these little things called hyphae. These guys cannot be called a fungus because they're not multicellular. Fungus is multicellular. And the exception to that rule are these things are yeast, like the yeast we used to make dough with. Well, yeast is called a fungus, but it's the only fungus that's not multicellular. So they're actually talking about taking yeast out of the fungus group and putting it into this group because it fits these characteristics better. You're like, but I can see that. This is what's called slime mold. This was actually taken in my backyard on some mulch. But each of these are one individual cells that come together and act like a group. So even though this looks like a fungus, it's actually made up of thousands and thousands and thousands of unicellular creatures. And they all come together to help each other feed and reproduce. So to be a fungus, you're multicellular. These guys can't be called fungi because they're not multicellular. They're unicellular. But they'll come together and act and help each other and act as a big group. But they're still unicellular creatures. So like I mentioned, slime molds, water molds, these things called downy mildews. But in Kingdom Protista, again, this is what we call the junkyard kingdom. If you have a nucleus, but you're not a plant, an animal, or fungus, we have to put you somewhere. So Kingdom Protista was created as this leftover category.